Either by demons, spirits, or monsters, or all of them, these forests are haunted. You will find the unexplained in these woods. And if it leaves you alive, it may not leave you fully sane. Today, I've got some allegedly true and scary stories about the terrifying things that haunt our forests. Now let's begin. Zvolenik, translating to the follower, or the pursuer, was a well-known myth in my town. It was a short and simple tale. It went like this. If you were ever alone in the woods, especially after dark, you might attract a spirit. It would become infatuated with you. To it, you represented a world different than its own. And as such, it would pursue you. When the spirit, your Zvolenik, had chosen you, it would make itself known by a whisper and 3 claps of its hands. If you were to be chosen by the Zvolenik, it would protect you from any beasts prowling the woods, and it would always ensure you would make it home before dark. It sounds rather pleasant, right? As expected, though, there is a clause. It would always follow directly behind you. And should you ever turn around while it was following you and look upon it, it would steal you away and drag you back with it into the realm beyond, from where you would never return. That's how the story goes, anyway. I never looked much into it. Little tales like this enriched our small town, but they were supposed to be taken with a grain of salt. On occasion, a friend might joke about attracting a Zvolenik if we were ever walking through the woods, but that was about as far as it went, at least for the majority of my time growing up. In my last year of school, my country's equivalent of high school, I was walking home one day. I remember it being fall. The air was crisp and cold, and leaves were crunching beneath my feet. Often I would cut through the forest, as it saved a good amount of time to and from school, and I'd rarely see anyone else. That day was no different until I reached about the middle point from where I would enter and exit the school. I heard a strange noise. It was loud enough to pull me away from my music, so I took my headphones off and I looked at where it had come from. It sounded like something shooting over my head, and so I gazed up, but I saw nothing. Then another noise sounded just behind me. I turned, seeing nothing beyond a few up-kicked leaves, as if something had landed that I couldn't see. More leaves were kicked up, as it seemed to take off again. Then I heard something else. Children's laughter echoing from it into the woods and towards me. Odder still, there were so many voices. It sounded like an entire class of children laughing ceremoniously in unison. And just as whatever it was moved off, the sound lessened. The ordeal only lasted a few seconds, and yet I stood there perplexed. I could not rationalize it. I was positive that something had been ripping its way through the forest, but how could I not have seen it? And how could it have possibly been laughing in such a way? I didn't have a clue. Still confused, I continued my walk at a hurried pace, making it out of the woods without incident. That strange encounter occupied my thoughts for most of the evening. I remember telling my partner at the time about it. He seemed convinced it was a group of children playing in the woods, but I was positive it was no bunch of kids. Of course, I had no other suggestions as to what it could have been, and so the topic was left alone. The next morning, I left home earlier than usual. If you were in my place, you may have decided to avoid the woods altogether, but I wanted to know more. The forest was very familiar to me, and the unique experience made it seem alien despite all my hours inside of it. So, if not to make myself more secure, I wanted to go and see if I could find what I'd seen the previous day. I walked through the woods, returning to the spot where the encounter had happened. This time, though, I was actively watching my surroundings. The entire area seemed devoid of movement. Even the few leaves left on the branches were holding still. I saw nothing out of the ordinary until I neared where I'd been the day before. It was like I stepped over an invisible line. As I crossed a point between 2 large rocks, a chill washed over my entire body. Despite my long coat, I shivered. With the cold sensation came another feeling. The distinct sense of being watched grabbed hold of me, and I hurriedly scanned the woods around me, entirely positive a mountain lion or another predator was preparing to pounce on me. There was nothing, though. No animal in sight. No signs to indicate any danger whatsoever. And yet, an alarm was still ringing in my head, indicating to me that something was out there. I took a step forward, and as I did, an impact sounded from up ahead. The unmistakable sound of something landing on the forest floor captured my attention. I looked up, seeing nothing immediately. As I focused, though, I began to see something strange. Leaves were being disturbed on the forest floor. It was like something was walking on them. I could even hear a crunch as each imprint formed. I watched on, utterly confused. It seemed an invisible creature was walking towards me. It soon became clear that this is what had been watching me. Instinctively, I paced backwards, stumbling as I collided with one of the large rocks I'd previously passed. I fell over it, landing on the leaves lining the ground. As quickly as I could, I regained my footing, hopelessly searching with my eyes for something that I could not see. It seemed that it was gone, though. No more leaves were being stepped on, and there was no inexplicable sounds. I relaxed, my nerves calming down. I remember laughing to myself, immediately trying to brush it off as something that I'd imagined. As if to argue against me, though, I suddenly picked up on faint laughter that sounded again, as if it was coming from a group of children. Of course, I left after that, giving one more curious look to the two rocks I'd passed through. I didn't bother telling anyone about it. If I had, I certainly would have been chastised. For the next few days, I wondered about what I'd seen. I am a logical person, and I tried my best to explain it as a trick of the senses, a trick created by a very rare environmental phenomenon. But I never truly believed any explanation I came up with. What stuck with me the most the next few weeks as I opted to avoid the woods was the sense of malice I felt. Despite not even being able to see what it was, I felt as if I'd been staring down a predator who had the singular intention to hurt me. This was reason enough to take the long way to and from school for the next while. Eventually the calendar had rolled into December, and we had experienced our town's first snowfall. It was light, only dusting the ground and chilling the air. I was a hobbyist photographer at the time, and I loved capturing scenic photos of the trees during the winter season. I wrestled with my past experiences in the woods for a little while, still not entirely over what had happened. Eventually I decided to go, but only because I would be accompanied by my partner. Not being alone made it much easier. I no longer felt at risk, and if I did see it again, so would another person. As we entered the forest, I felt a little on edge. Not quite the polarizing sensation of being watched, but still a strange sensation. I brushed it off, intent on snapping a series of lovely photos. And I did just that. We went on a scenic tour, though I insisted on avoiding the general area where the two encounters had previously taken place. Nothing strange happened, and I finished with a camera roll of 20 or so lovely shots, even being lucky enough to capture a bird in one. When I told him I was ready to leave, he suggested we should go and get some coffee. It was cold out, with the sun already beginning to set, and so I agreed. Without much thought, I followed him as he led us out of the forest. Not quickly enough, I realized we were nearing the area I'd had the strange encounter in. I wanted to say something, but I thought it foolish. After all, cutting through would save us a few minutes, and I figured I'd be just fine with the company of another person. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as the familiar pair of rocks came into view. They sat innocently dusted in snow. For some reason, I found myself fascinated by them. They lacked any reason to capture my attention on their own, but even so, I approached them. Idly, I wondered if they were related to what I'd encountered. I got no answer as I passed between them, continuing to walk up the now white trail. Only a few seconds later, however, that sensation of being watched returned. It was the exact same from the previous encounter. Immediately, I looked towards my partner, but to my horror, he was no longer there. He had left my field of view for only a handful of seconds, and yet he had completely disappeared. I called out his name as I walked forward. No response. My walk turned into a run as I looked up and down the near dark forest, but still, I found nothing. No one. The terrible feeling of being stalked became overbearing, and so I took off, running in a random direction. I kept going and going, but no matter how far I went, I could not escape it. Suddenly, as I stopped to catch my breath, I heard something cut through the air above me. From sound alone, I heard an impact on the floor. I glanced over, seeing leaves disturbed, but of course, nothing that could have done it. The woods had grown quiet, and over my labored breathing, I heard the crunch of steps being taken. From small visual cues, I could tell it was no more than 10 feet away from me. It came closer, and fatigued as I was, I did not run. Instead, I only watched where I assumed the invisible thing was as it approached. I remember falling backwards as the wind seemed to pick up out of nowhere. It was loud, heavy, almost warm, even despite the chill of a winter night. Within a few seconds, it died down, and then terrifyingly, I heard my name whispered right into my ear. Dax. 3 sharp sounds followed, as if there was something large and hooved, stamping the ground just behind me. The invisible entity, now only feet from me, took one last audible step forward before it too stopped. There I sat, convinced I was going to die, because I foolishly returned to these woods, waiting as it seemingly stood still. Then, without warning, I watched as leaves were suddenly kicked up in a flurry. It was no longer walking. It was as if it was being dragged away from me, no less. Two thick lines in the frosted dirt were created as the invisible entity was ripped backwards further into the woods. A sound emanated from its direction, not of children's laughter, though. It was a child crying. A single male child crying. It quieted just as the disturbance of leaves disappeared. I do not know how long I waited there. Eventually, I did stand up, finding it hard to keep my balance as my freezing legs struggled to hold up the rest of my body. I had no idea what had happened, and though the feeling of being watched had left me, I realized it had been replaced with something else. The familiar presence of support. It was as if I wasn't alone. Not like there was a threat, mind you. Something kind like a friend was there with me. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I wanted to turn around, believing it to be my boyfriend, but it soon became clear it was not ordinary. There was a heat emanating from the hand that seemed to cleanse the cold out of my entire body. Before I could make a move, I watched frost in front of me beginning to melt from the ground. It was inexplicable, as it was most likely below zero at the time. Not all the snow was melting, either. I watched as it formed a path, a 1-foot-wide path, being slowly cut through the snow, the fresh colors of healthy grass and leaves contrasting with the icy white of the rest of the woods. Somehow totally trusting this, I followed the path. It wound and wove seemingly all about the woods, but within minutes I knew where I was again. It led just between the two rocks, the same two I'd passed through before the affair happened. The warm hand on my shoulder encouraged me as I walked forward, and finally I felt it disappear as I passed between the two rocks. Just as I did, I fell forward. The warmth and comfort I'd felt had vanished, so suddenly I lost my balance. Quickly I recovered, and wanting to find out what had guided me back, I spun around. But of course there was nothing. Looking past the rocks, there was no pathway of healthy grass, nor any entity that could have been responsible for the hand on my shoulder. I stood there for a moment, perplexed, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, smiling as my partner ran up and hugged me. He began to ask me where I'd gone, telling me he had panicked and was searching all around for me. With no valid explanation to give, I hugged him back. We stayed like that for a few minutes, before we both opted to leave the now dark woods. That is where my story ends. I have dwelled on it for many years, and I have a few theories as to what exactly occurred. I think the twin rocks served as some kind of barrier or gateway into a different place, for lack of a better word. I can only guess as to the identity of the invisible thing that seemed to pursue me, though I do not doubt for a moment its intentions were hostile. As for what protected me, what warmed my freezing body and guided me to safety, I firmly believe that it was as Wolenic. Why it chose me that night I will never know. Of course, I often find myself wondering what would have happened had I turned around and faced it with its hand on my shoulder. Perhaps I would not be here to write my story. Remember to be careful when you're in the woods. Beyond dangerous animals and landscapes, there may be other things we lack the ability to understand. Story number 2. This happened around the time I was 15 years old. My cousin, who was down on his luck, was staying with us for a while. He had just turned 21, so of course I thought he was the coolest person ever, and I wanted to do everything he did. We would oftentimes walk 3 miles or so to the nearest gas station, once my younger brothers were settled in bed, so that he could get a beer if we had nothing else better to do. The two of us were both night owls, and this was the summer time, so I didn't have to worry about school. My dad also worked nights, and my mom had passed away by this point, so it wasn't hard to keep it a secret, as it was just the two of us. One night on our way back from one of these trips, my cousin wanted to stop by the small church cemetery that we passed on our way to the gas station and see if we could pick up any weird activity. I live in a small town in Georgia, so there wasn't really much else for us to get into at this point, and neither one of us had a car. Needless to say, it didn't take much convincing, because again my cousin was quote-unquote older and cooler than I was, so I wanted to do whatever he did. When we got to the cemetery, I felt a weird vibe, but because it was such a small church cemetery, I didn't think we'd get into any trouble. After all, I'd been in a cemetery many times after dark, including on Halloween to visit my mother's gravesite. I was trying not to psych myself out too bad, but I could tell my cousin felt it too. This is going to show my age, but this was also a time before smartphones. The highest quality phone available at the time was a Razr, BlackBerry, or Sidekick, and my dad was definitely not going to spend money on something like that for me. My cousin wanted to see if we could get some orbs, but neither of our cameras were really good enough to amount to anything. So after a little while, we were about to give up. We weren't supposed to be out this late anyway. By then, it was between 3 and 4 in the morning. As we headed back to the road, I felt the air change all of a sudden, and the hair on the back of my neck began to stand on end. Now remember, this was the summertime in Georgia, so even though it was night, it was often warm and muggy thanks to the humidity. I then saw my cousin stop a few feet ahead of me, so I stopped too. Dusty, what do you see?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly and barely above a whisper. He held his hand up to indicate I should be quiet. I remember biting my lip and just freezing in place. All of a sudden, the temperature in the air around me dropped significantly, and I began to shiver slightly. "Dusty, I really don't like this. We should go home." I breathed as I started to creep closer to him. I wrapped my arms around myself, attempting to warm myself, and I remember thinking that I should have brought a jacket, even though I'd never needed one for these adventures before. As I waited for my cousin to move, or say or do something, I felt something tickle the back of my neck. At this point, I was already starting to freak out, so I jumped and turned around as fast as I could to see what it was. There was nothing there, and I chided myself for getting scared in front of my big cousin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had felt like fingers that had tickled me. Before I could react further, I heard my cousin let out a breath that I don't even think he even realized he'd been holding in. "Jess, when I say go, you need to run as fast as you can. We need to get home now," he said firmly, but there was an eerie calmness in his voice. I followed his gaze, and I had to do a double take, and the woods across the street was what looked to be a hooded figure walking away from us further into the trees. "Dusty, this isn't funny," I mumbled, my anxiety beginning to increase with every passing second. Before I could react any further, he said to me, "Now," and we started to sprint out of the cemetery, back onto the road. Now I was never in any good shape, and I was not a fan of running at all, but I somehow stayed with my cousin as he ran towards our house. We were still a good mile and a half away at this point, though, and I wasn't sure I could make it the whole way at this pace. I did it, though, and as we made the last turn towards my house, we were just about to pass the horse farm on the corner, and then we would be home free in my yard. We both stopped dead in our tracks, and the middle of the road was a figure that was maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. It was just standing there in the middle of the road, its back to us, and it was pure black. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I was afraid that if I turned to go towards the woods, it would see or hear us. Before either of us could react any further, the figure turned slowly and lifted its head to look at us. All I saw under the hood were 2 piercing red eyes that felt as if they were staring directly into my soul. The rest was completely pitch black. I couldn't make out any features despite the street light not too far away from us. After a few seconds, which felt like hours, none of us moved. Eventually the figure did turn, and he walked the rest of the way towards the street, disappearing into the woods. From there, my cousin and I double-timed it home. I remember grabbing the poker from the fireplace when we got back, and sleeping with it that night, even though I didn't really get much sleep. We never did see that figure again, but I remember that was the scariest thing I've ever encountered. We lived at that house for several more years after that, and I never did experience anything like it again. I'm not sure if we upset a spirit by going to the cemetery that night, or if it was something else, but I hope to never go through anything like it again. Story number 3. My grandparents have a couple of 100 acres of land in a little town called Castleton, Vermont. My friends and I go up there almost every week to ride 4-wheelers or even play airsoft in the woods. Nothing out of the ordinary has ever happened until around a dark, cold night in November of 2020. My friends and I were just wrapping up our last game of airsoft, noting that it was pitch black and that we'd decided to get out of the woods. As we were leaving, we stepped out of the tree line into a massive field where even in the dark you could see everything. We put our guns away and we started up the vehicle when one of my friends I'll call John pointed something out in the distance. I was thinking it was a deer or coyote. I looked in the direction he was pointing at and I didn't see anything. "Bro," I said, "there's nothing over there." He insists and tells me to look next to the camper. As I'm squinting my eyes, trying to see what he's talking about, my other friend Sam said he saw it too. This camper can't be more than a football field away, so I'm getting frustrated not being able to see what they're talking about. Sam then said, "Oh my God, it's moving." Finally, I was able to make it out. It stood tall next to the camper, almost peering around it like it was trying to hide. Us being daring teens, we started to walk closer to it, thinking whoever it was, we could take them on. But as we get closer, so does the figure. We stop and let it move, and now it's more visible. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, with long arms that looked to be almost touching the ground. It just stopped and stood there, swaying back and forth until silence took over the field. Nothing but wind, a slight breeze, us and this thing that was still swaying. Then there was this terrible scream that sounded like someone was constantly being stabbed without dying. We booked it back to the car and slammed the door shut. When the lights inside the car went out automatically, as they're supposed to, we were able to better see outside again. I quietly said, "Wait guys, look, it's not over there anymore." As we all stared out of the right side of the car, trying to locate it again, we heard a tapping sound. We looked at each other in shock, trying to find the exact source of the tapping. John began to scream suddenly, and he pointed to the back of the car. We look, and we see the figure standing there, its face inches from the window. I call it its face only to describe that area of its body, because it didn't actually have any face at all. It was just a dark, human-shaped silhouette. Then it screamed. It was so loud we had to cover our ears. It wasn't a normal scream, I recognized it. It sounded like John. The scream that he'd made only 2 minutes ago. It was now coming from this figure, just 10 times louder. I yelled for Sam to step on it and get us back to the house. I quickly turned around to look outside the window to see what its next move would be. It was hard to make out, but it looked like it was waving. Not like a goodbye wave, more like it was saying, "See you next time." We got back to my grandparents' house, shaken and scared. My grandma asked us, "What's the matter, boys?" We all began to tell her the story of what we saw and what happened, wondering how she didn't hear that scream. Her face turned very serious, and she told us, "You boys probably should stay the night tonight." Taking her up on the offer, we agreed. There was no way we were going to drive out on that road in the middle of the night with woods on both sides of us. Trying to forget about it, we all sat down and played some Monopoly. At about 10 o'clock, we'd been playing for a couple of hours, when we began to hear a tapping. All of us jumped up and booked it to the window. We turned on the light outside, and there it was. The figure from before was back. It was standing next to the car now, clearly towering over it. It began to walk away, facing us the entire time, clearly showing us he was still there. Then it turned around and ran on all fours. Our minds were blown, each of us thinking this isn't possible. We cracked the window just a little bit to see if we could hear anything else, and all we could hear was the distant sound of John's screaming. We shut the window and agreed never to play airsoft at night again, not out here. It's been a year now, and nothing else strange has occurred, but I know it's out there. Maybe it's watching us in those woods, hoping we stay till nightfall again. The following story is that infamous 4chan story from Korea that I removed a long time ago, but viewers have kept asking me to bring it back, so here it is for all of you to enjoy. Also, it is very much a haunted woods kind of story too. Story number 4. Hi X. Long-time lurker, first-time posting here. Anyone interested in Far East spooky stuff? Be me, German descent. Parents moved to Korea before I was born. Because dad's going on business trips all the time and general parental conflict, my Korean friend's family pretty much raised me as their own. My new family is crazy superstitious, which is weird since most of the country now believes in Christianity, or at least at the time they did. Live in the mountains with Korean family for most of my childhood, then moved to the city around high school age. I honestly didn't even consider this all to be creepy when it all happened to me. It was just a part of life. Eventually I moved to the US, and whenever I mention the stuff that happened in my childhood to my new friends, they lose their crap. I guess I'll post a few and see if you guys might be interested. Here's a little background. My Korean foster family is from North Korea. They all came down during the Korean War. There's a superstitious grandfather, Christian grandmother, both maternal. The mother and father, who are friends with my parents, who always wanted to get the heck out of the mountains. There's a daughter who was my age, and was pretty much my only friend. The grandfather is the patriarch, and what he says goes. This includes all sorts of weird traditional ceremonies and rituals, and a lot of creepy hiking fishing trips. Generally, it's a pretty chill family. Lots of conflict about grandfather's superstitious bullcrap though, and you can kinda see the mom losing her mind over the years for some unknown reason. We lived in the middle of nowhere. You have to drive like 30 minutes to reach the nearest town. Sorry if this is all jumbled. This is my first time rationally looking back and writing it down. This is about a ritual we used to do a few times every year. Apparently there are families in the city that also perform it, but none of my other Korean friends have gone through quite what I was used to. On the death day of his ancestors, grandfather would set up a mini shrine and prepare a crapload of food. It always had to be specific kinds of dishes and had to be arranged according to color and size. After setting up the food on special tables in the living room, grandfather read a handwritten letter, generally following the lines of, "Everyone misses you. Rest well. Please take this offering of food in peace." Then burns it. He sometimes added a line about me, something along the lines of, "Please excuse the blonde boy, we're taking care of him," as the ritual is usually only performed by family. Everyone took turns bowing in a special ceremonial way. When everyone was done bowing, grandfather turned off all the lights, and everyone hid in the kitchen for about half an hour. You always have to clear your throat before walking out again, as to not startle the ancestors, grandfather says. The food was always partially eaten, utensils would be dirty, and the seat cushions would feel warm when we entered the mini shrine again. This one time when I was about 6 years old, the mom got tired of making these specific dishes. They were very time-consuming. They took the whole day for her to make, so instead this year she made easier ones. Grandfather flies into a fit of rage, but we don't have time to redo everything. "Do you realize what you've done?" And all that. We finish bowing and hide in the kitchen as usual, but we hear rattling and banging from the living room where the shrine is. The kids are scared, so me and the daughter hold on to the grandfather while he swears under his breath. An hour later the noise stops, grandfather clears his throat, then he leaves the kitchen and goes into the living room. What a mess. The dishes are overturned, candles have been blown out, and something that looks like either dried blood or watery fecal matter, I can't remember which, is strewn about on the shrine. After that, the mom always made the correct dishes. So nine-tailed foxes, man. Those things are creepy as heck, but the media always portrays them as some kind of busted cutie pie furry's wet dream. So I was 13. Up in the mountains we didn't have access to anything, risque, but that didn't keep me from discovering how to pleasure myself. One day I go into the mountains with daughter, who we'll call Jean, to find some mushrooms. I bring one of the family Jindo dogs just to be safe. Those things are protective as all hell. We're having a good time playing around when Ogu, the Jindo, starts to bark like crazy. We turn and see a teenage-looking girl, just kind of standing there, wearing old-fashioned clothes. But since this is a rural area, we didn't even think twice about it. We go over to say hi. We were just happy to find someone else around our age. The new girl says her family moved into the empty lot about 15 minutes away. Ogu is still barking at her, but we brush it off. He's just being protective. We hang out with her a bit, and she keeps touching me, commenting on my hair and eyes, saying I look exotic and cute. I was totally flustered. The sun starts going down, so we ask her if she wants to come over and have dinner with us. No, she says, but only Anand can come over to my place to see my room if he wants. It's getting dark and my brotherly instinct kicks in, so I tell the new girl I'll drop by later, but I have to take Jean home first. Later on, we tell grandfather what happened. Idiot boy, that empty plot isn't for sale. From then on, he tells us we have to take a Jindo wherever we go. But we do meet that girl again a few times later that week. She progressively gets more and more seductive to me. The dogs bark at her, so we just go home when we see her. We would go home and tell grandfather that we saw her again. A few days after that, Ogu, the dog, brings home a fox he had killed, and not once ever again do we see that girl. Basically, nine-tailed foxes, gumaho, shape-shift into women whose corpses they eat. They seduce and kill men, and they eat their livers. Once they eat 1,000 livers, it is said they will turn into real humans. Grandfather said there are 2 types of ghosts, Yuryong, which are docile spirits, and Guishin, which are malicious spirits that usually just want closure. There was a small lake near where we lived. Grandfather always told us to take away to a Jindo when we went near the lake, as there was a Guishin who lived there. Guishin who live in bodies of water are called Muo Guishin, but this one was also a Konyo Guishin, a virgin who had been wronged. Occasionally from far away, you can make out a youngish-looking woman who looks soaked as heck just sitting on the dock. Always thought she looked lonely, sad, not at all angry. She didn't do much, but kind of hissed almost like a cat, and disappeared whenever she saw the white Jindo, named Jingu. This one time when I was 9 years old, I got brave and walked out to the lake. It was still pretty far away, but I could see the Guishin sitting on the dock again. Being the oddest that I am, I call out something like, "Hey lady, are you okay?" The Guishin gets up and starts walking towards me. When I say walking, it was like a cross between walking and gliding, kind of like when you stand still and look at someone going through one of those moving runways in an airport. The guishin keeps coming closer, and suddenly I realize that I forgot to bring a white jindo. Oh crap, I think. The guishin is close now, and I can see that her facial features are all kind of dark and melted together, like ink mixing in water. I scream now, and she screams too, but stops when I stop making noise and just sort of studies me. She makes a weird gurgling sound, like someone trying to laugh underwater. Your head is yellow. She walks/glides back to the dock. I run all the way back home, fresh pee cooling on my pants. The next day grandfather makes me bring some food as an offering to the lake, to thank the guishin for not harming me. I like to think instead that I made her day. Here's some info on the jindo, the dogs we had. They're Korea's national dog, kind of like a Shiba, but taller, leggier, and more brutal. They come in 3 colors, white, tan, and a sort of black tan. They're hardy little guys, skinny, but they can take out your legs like it's nothing. They're very protective and territorial. They're stubborn too. You can't train them like a Labrador retriever to do cute tricks or sit for their food or not bite annoying children, but they'll give their lives to protect you and your home. In Korean superstition, white jindos chase away evil spirits, tan jindos can fight their way out of anything, and black jindos make spirits accept you as one of them. Grandfather rarely had black jindos. He was a fighter, so he had a bunch of tan jindos and a few white ones for the kids, and I'm pretty sure the shotgun he had in the closet was illegal, because you can't own guns in Korea. Now, anyone up for a Korean troll? I was 11 years old. Our toughest tan jindo died, so grandfather got another one. He's a hard one even when he's a puppy. He becomes loyal to grandfather and Jean. By the time he's 1 year old, he's bigger and brawnier than the other dogs by far. We name him Sukku. One day Jean wants to go down to the creek and catch some fish. Grandfather tells her to take a white jindo, but instead she takes Sukku. I'm contemplating going with her, but I was helping grandmother out with some chores, so I stayed behind. Besides, I got the feeling that her mom hated me being around her daughter too often. A few hours later, we hear something that sounds like a tiger from the mountains. I ask grandfather about it, as tigers are probably extinct in Korea. Might be dukkebye. The dukkebye are pretty much Korean trolls. They don't really mean serious harm, but they're very strong and they do like to mess with people. Sometimes they'll unwittingly drive someone mad or outright kill them. The sun was going down, but Jean and Sukku aren't home yet. Grandfather was getting worried. Sometime later we see Jean running home alone, but she's screaming. She says that a human hand with claws on it came out of the bushes. She ran home, but the last she saw was Sukku jumping into the bush to fight whatever was there. Her parents try to reason and say it was probably a lost person. Grandfather brushes that off. You two were raised in the city and know nothing. Why would a lost person be far away from a town? Then we see something run towards the house from far away. It's Sukku. He's got a freaking leg in his mouth. It looks like a human leg, but it's completely covered in thick hair and was way bigger. It's gnawed through the thigh, but there's no blood. Just a weird watery splatter all over it. And there's a bit on Sukku as well. Grandfather confirms that it is a dakibi and throws out the leg deep into the mountains. We put out food for the next week as an apology to its clan. They leave human-like crap in our yard as a sort of screw you for the next month. The thing about growing up in rural Korea as a foreigner is that if you run into a spirit, they're either going to be extra hostile towards you, or they're going to be so busy laughing at you, they don't even bother to try harming you. The closest school was half an hour away, so grandfather would drive me and Jean to school every morning. There were only 7 kids in the grade. Only 3 graduated. The rest either died or moved to the city. The kids were pretty cruel and ganged up on me a lot, calling me names like Yellow Monkey or Yankee or Yinky, which was funny because I'm German. Grandfather thought school was crap, so he let me skip school as long as I showed up for exams and passed them. When I was 10, he got me my very own white jindo named Bekku. One day I went exploring the mountains and eating mushrooms. I hear something rustling in the bushes, and Bekku starts whimpering and cowering. A black dog-like creature slinks out from the bushes. I freeze in my tracks, not sure if he was friendly or malicious, but Bekku was clearly scared and pissing himself. The thing looked like a cross between a big dog and a leopard, but it had a long, almost trunk-like snout, fur that looked ablaze and smoldering, although there was no fire or heat. The thing makes a snarling, growling motion, but no sound comes out of its mouth. I was convinced then that I was going to die. But then I hear a gunshot go off in the distance, and remember that grandfather had an illegal gun. Another shot goes off, this time so close my ears, my whole skull feels like it's ringing, and I swear I see a bullet whiz by. The thing chases after the bullet, and it's gone. I hightail it out of there with my dog and grandfather. What I ran into turned out to be a bullgossery. They eat fire and metal, and they're highly hostile. As this one had claimed the deep mountains as its home, we were forbidden to go that deep from then on. One thing about Korean ghosts, both docile and malicious, is that they're very much like people. You can reason with them most of the time, trick them, scare them, and even make friends. Of course, if you just want them to leave you alone, the best thing you can do is start singing, although grandfather said this could potentially attract Dakibi. I was 14, going to school one day because screw it. When school ended, I left my book bag in the classroom, then I go out with Jean to throw the trash away. The school had no janitors, so the kids had to help with the work. I go pick up the bag while Jean waits outside, the teacher standing with her back to the door just kind of staring at the wall. I say goodbye to her, but she doesn't respond to me. I get slightly nervous, so I go up and ask if she's okay. She turns around, and I nearly soil myself because her face is gone. Dalgil Shin are malicious spirits that act like people, but they don't have faces, hence the name Dalgil, which means egg. They'll usually leave you alone, as long as you don't point out their lack of face or act disgusted. Anyway, the spirit acts just like the teacher, and it's just heading way too close to the uncanny valley now. I'm creeped out, but also kind of mad, because I was a moody teenager and I just wanted to go home. The thing started talking, and even its voice sounded like my teacher. Anan, do you think I'm pretty? You don't even have a face, I thought, but I don't want to anger it, because these ghosts can get vicious when they're mad. If I say you're pretty, it will say I'm lying because it clearly doesn't have a face, but if I said you're not pretty, it will say I'm disgusted at its lack of a face. I just wanted to go home and play with my goddamn dog and go fishing, so I started singing the Korean national anthem really loud. The thing began screaming, sounding equally angry. I hear the classroom door open, and the screaming stops abruptly. Anan, what are you doing? This time it's the actual teacher. She's in the doorway. I then run home, complaining about the Gui Shin with Jen. Things started falling apart by my mid-teen years. I believe this was because grandfather was getting old and weak, but it might be because I was pretty messed up emotionally, and particular spirits could sense it. I was 16, doing some chores around the yard when I hear familiar voices. Voices I hadn't heard in a while. My own mother. My own father. I walk towards their voices, kind of tearing up. I haven't seen them since I was 4 years old, and the only reason I remembered them were from phone calls that came only every few months. I was angry but mostly glad. My parents were standing at the edge of my grandfather's property, calling out to me. Anan, it's us. Let's go home now. So many things I wanted to yell at them about, but it's like I'm too choked up. But then I remembered my grandfather didn't tell me that my parents would be coming. I'm gonna go get grandfather first, I called out. Oh, but Anan, aren't you going to let your mother hug her own son? I noticed something was wrong about it, but I was too emotionally shaken. I began crying and kind of stood there. The dogs were barking like crazy, and I could hear Jean calling me for dinner from the house. But my parents kept urging me to come over and give them a hug. To go home. To talk to them. Come on, son. It's going to be a long drive home. I waited for a second. But where's your car? They go quiet, but soon try to play it off as a joke. But I kept asking. They grew angry, began threatening me with punishments, telling me I'm breaking my mother's heart. I'm still crying, hyperventilating, not sure whether to go with them or run back home. I think Jean must have seen me and told my grandfather. He came out with a dog on a leash who began growling. Then the old Korean man began to bellow like an ox. Leave my grandson alone, freaking creatures. My parents let out something like a cross between a bird screeching and an old door creaking. Then they disappeared in the tall grass. For some reason, grandfather never spoke of this again, and that crap still chokes me up a little. Now here's the story of how our toughest dog died. Some relatives came to visit, and some relatives came to visit for the weekend. Jean's cousins come too. One is a guy about 5 years older than us. The other guy is about 2 years older. There's also a girl, but she just sits in the kitchen and does Bible study with grandmother all day, so we just ignore her. We try to get along with them at first, but the cousins are just too boisterous. They're yelling cuss words in the mountains, throwing rocks at deer. Eventually, we just let them do their own thing. It turns out while Jean, grandfather, and I went fishing, these idiots went into the mountains and found a small family graveyard. Korean family graveyards are tiny, with 4 or 5 bodies buried at most, especially if you find one in the rural areas. Anyway, these guys trashed the place, kicking down shrines and littering everywhere. They came home after they heard someone crying and got scared. Grandfather was seething, but he doesn't say anything. He doesn't expect city kids to understand. For the next few days, we see angry ghosts at the edge of our property hissing at the dogs, but unable to come any closer because of our white jindos. We leave offerings around the property, but they are mad and they won't stop trashing our vegetable gardens. Grandfather genuinely looks stumped. One day our most prized tanjindo disappears. We think he may have gone hunting something, but he doesn't come home for days. Eventually we go out to look for him. A warning in this section, as it contains explicit depictions of violence against animals. You've been warned. Skip ahead about 30 seconds. So we find his body ripped to shreds strewn around the trashed graveyard. His intact head is in front of the damaged shrine. Grandfather quietly covers his dog's head with a towel. He doesn't talk to us for a few days, just smokes his pipe out on the patio, staring into the mountains. I still miss that dog. I like to think he sacrificed himself as an offering to save us all. In Korean mythology, magpies are harbingers of good luck and prosperity. It's said if you hear a magpie cawing in the morning, it means you'll have a friendly visitor later in the day. I like to think that magpies acted like a sort of guardian angel to me. My room was on the 2nd floor, right next to the persimmon tree in the garden. Magpies freaking love persimmons, and there are always a bunch of them near the house. Grandfather and I made a habit of leaving the persimmons at the very top when picking them from the tree, so that the magpies can help themselves. That happened to be at the level of my window, so I guess the magpies kind of associated my face with food and general good vibes. I come home from school one day, and for some reason I'm tired as heck, so I take a nap, but the magpies won't stop cawing. Some even banged and packed at the window, which was unusual for them. Like an oddist, I yell, "Shut up, birds," and try to sleep, but they're way too loud. Cursing, I get up and storm out of the room to sleep somewhere else. As I turn to close the door, I catch a glimpse of something stuck to my ceiling. It's a person, no, a spirit of some kind. As I stare at it, its head turns towards me and gives me the ugliest look, but before it can react to me leaving the room, the magpies start cawing and banging at the window. It turns its attention to the birds. I run out, and I alert my grandfather. He grabs a pot and pan and runs up to my room, flinging open the door and banging them together while yelling, "Get out." The ghost hisses and slithers into the cracks of the wall. We knew someone died in that house before we moved in. We just didn't know the guy had hung himself in my freaking room. We leave out an offering that night, and I sleep on the couch. The next morning, the offering is gone, and we don't see the spirit again for another 3 months. But when we do see it, the magpies do their squawks, and I fetch grandfather. Feels pretty good having a personal army of magpies. Now on to the last story. I was 17 years old, and I was starting to have a thing for Jean, but we didn't show it, because A, it felt like incest, and B, her mother was completely off the hook at this point and would kill us both. One day grandfather goes to tend to his berry patches and doesn't come back. We look for him, and a few hours later, we find him on the ground, looking peaceful and composed, like he just laid there to take a nap, but never woke up. Doctors tell us he died of a heart attack. We're stunned. The man who took me in after my own family put me aside, taught me all my values that I ever held dear, kept me alive all these years in a patch of mountain crawling with unknown creatures and spirits. He was gone just like that. Jean was inconsolable. We spent a lot of time out by grandfather's favorite fishing spot, not really saying much. We buried him in a private plot. Jean and I go to his grave every day to clean the shrine. A few months later, grandmother sells our house, and we end up moving to the city. All the dogs are sold too, including mine. I'm too shocked to pretend nothing happened, to continue living with my adopted family, too angry to live with my biological family. So grandmother gives me enough money to rent a small apartment, barely larger than a closet. I couldn't focus on anything, so I ended up failing my college entrance exams. I barely scraped by, flipping burgers, working at gas stations, convenience stores, stocking warehouses. In a way, it's more peace than I'd ever known, as there were no ghosts or spirits in my apartment. Sometimes I wonder about what happened to Jean as we grew apart, and I knew her mother was off her rocker, and sometimes even physically hurt her. Meanwhile, Jean herself was accepted to a good college. One day we decided to go to grandfather's grave and show him the acceptance letter, as well as perform the ritual, the one mentioned earlier about the food and the things. and we don't talk to each other. For some reason, the whole family followed us there. It was getting dark, and just before we left, Jean placed her acceptance letter on grandfather's shrine. Suddenly her mother starts screaming like mad. "He's dead, you crazy kids. Can't freaking hear you, or see any of this crap." She accuses grandfather of being crazy, yelling at Jean for being stupid enough to believe all his bullcrap, she said. We tried to argue back, reminding her that she had witnessed a lot of the stuff we'd seen, but she was raving at this point. Eventually she calmed down enough for Jean's dad to take her back to the car. We just sat in front of grandfather's grave for the longest time. When we finally head back, I swear I can see a bluish flame-looking thing flickering above the grave. Weeks pass by. I was getting paid just enough to get by, and trying to forget everything that ever happened in my childhood. One night I hear incessant tapping on my window, almost like how the magpies used to tap. But that's weird, because I lived below ground level. There was no window. I then feel a deep shuddering cold in my guts. I always thought it was alerting me to a spirit nearby, but now I realize it's fear. I run wildly into the street and catch a taxi to Grandma's house. I can hear screaming inside the house. The door bursts open and Jean runs out, blood on her arms and her face white as paper. You see, something in her mother's head snapped, and she had grabbed a knife, slashing at Jean. If you're wondering about her dad and grandmother, her dad was visiting his family, and the grandmother was too afraid to come out of her room. Jean swears up and down that just as her mother was about to seriously stab her, a blue flame flickered out of nowhere and lit her skirt on fire. I tried my best to calm her down and called 911. Things settled down from there. Jean and I realized nobody else would understand us as well as each other. Well, we're getting married next winter. Her mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Grandmother goes to live with Jean's aunt, and I just want to say thanks to Grandpa for teaching me everything, for raising me to be a good guy. I wouldn't be here today without him. This brings us to the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, leave a comment, press the notification bell, and subscribe to our channel. And we will see you in our next story.